This podcast is brought to you in association with Neogi Books. Welcome back to the Kitabi Karwan podcast. Today's guest is special in more ways than one. All of us have read books about history and chased after figures we all have heard of throughout our lives. But today's author decided to chase a figure which almost none of us have heard of. Dr. Amit Ranjan decided to write a book, a biography, in fact, of John Lang, whose most infamous claim to fame is being the lawyer of Jhansi Ki Rani in her controversial case. But John Lang was a very interesting figure, being a prolific writer, journalist, lawyer who settled in India at the age of 26, who learned Persian and Urdu. John Lang was an enigma and was almost lost to history until Mr. Ruskin Bond discovered his grave in Missouri back in the 70s. Without giving anything away, let's jump right into the interview. Hello, Dr. Ranjan. Welcome to the Kitabi Karwan podcast. I'm so glad to have you on today. Uh, and just to all my listeners, Dr. Ranjan's book, his biography on John Lang, is easily one of the best books I've read in the 4 months that have gone by in 2022. It is supremely riveting to the extent that I think it's the subject matter and the really interesting narrative style Dr. Ranjan takes, which he told me, by the way, was the actual style he used for his PhD, which I'm again supremely curious about. So, Dr. Ranjan, without any further ado, I'll jump right to the question. Generally, I ask a very different first question to all my guests, but because we're doing this in a very different way, I'll ask you another one. Uh, why John Lang? I mean, I think history is such a deep and wide field. There are so many things to explore, and trust me, I'm not complaining here because I absolutely love the book. But what led you to him? I was flabbergasted that John Lang hasn't been written much more about. So, what led you to him?
Hi, Siddharth, and thank you so much for inviting me to your podcast, and thank you for your very generous introduction. Jumping straight to the subject, then, why John Lang um, is serendipity, accident, as most things in life are. Most important things in life are accidents. Birth is an accident, for that matter. Um, so I was looking, I was after something else, after someone else, somebody called Alice Richmond, who died in 1882 in Pune, in what is now the Pune University lawns. So I found this, a friend introduced me to this garden called the Alice Garden. And there I saw this grave of Alice, a lone grave, which is very fascinating. Uh, no, because it's in the middle of the university, there are all kinds of urban legends around it that she was in love with an Indian guy, and it was a case of unrequited love, so they committed suicide, or that a host haunts the campus at night in white robes in very Bollywood fashion, things of that order. But what enchanted me most was what I saw written on her grave, which is died at this spot and is buried at this very spot, which was eerie and romantic at the same time. And that's what got me hunting for Alice. And the question, who the X is Alice, came to my mind like the song. Um, and uh, for a year, I could not find anything. And then I found a poem um, in a book called The Cyclopedia of Australian Poetry, a compilation of 100 years, in which there was this poem called On the Death of Alice Richmond, died in Pune, 1882. And a year later, when I went to the grave, those words were not there. Those words I found on some other grave in Meerut 3 years later. So I won't go into the matter of Alice. It's a very interesting story and probably matter of another podcast. But I got interested to find out about Alice. I decided to find out about what Australians were doing in the 19th century. Um, and so I found John Lang on the way amongst various other Australians in the 19th century in India, and somebody who was taking on the Governor General, somebody who was very witty, who knew Persian. All of that was riveting, and I knew I had found my calling. for my PhD at least.
Right. Yeah, I mean, now when you even put it in that way, like even when I was reading the foreword and the preface about and the details about Alice, it just got me so fascinated with this facet of Indian history, which a lot of people aren't really aware about. Because generally, when you think of colonial times, you end up reading a lot more about, as you I think earlier mentioned, about civil servants or military generals, right, or administrators, but not
Right.
about the populace who was living here and well, inhabiting the country, and the kind of exploits, if I can use the word, what they were up to. uh,
Absolutely.
eh, but Dr. Ranjan, as it was a topic of your PhD, right, and as someone who's somewhat aware of academic work, I can understand how difficult the process would have been to piece together information, let alone on a scarce subject like John Lang. So it's actually a twofold question that I have for you. That a what was the process of actually going about it? Because I guess conventional sources would have failed, particularly when it comes to something, generally if it was a more something like, say, because it's John Lang, we can mention, say, the Rani of Jhansi. There's so much written about her. There's so many other references you can always go back and check. But I'm
Right.
guessing that's not the case with John Lang. And the second
Oh,
question
not at all.
actually, yeah, and the second question kind of flows from the first one, is to the extent that history in itself is such a subjective issue, right? I mean, you can, as the
Correct.
famous saying goes, the victors always write right history. But still, you have the pleasure or the opportunity of exploring different facets of popular subjects. But when it comes to scarce subjects, it becomes difficult to ascertain ex post facto what the truth is, or
Right.
what an objective stand could be. So, what were the mechanisms you kind of used for yourself, or to kind
Sure.
of
Sure.
keep your research in check and go about developing this?
Sure. So I was absolutely sorry, on a blind alley, like in the case of Alice, vis-a-vis John Lang. Now you can find something
Mhm.
on the internet, but it is almost simultaneous with my hunt. There were, we can count it on fingers. There are probably 4 or 5 people interested in John Lang way back in 2007 when I
Yeah.
started thinking about it. Ruskin Bond had discovered his grave in Missouri 40 years earlier,
Mhm.
in the 1960s, at that point in time. But he had written a short piece, and that was about it. He didn't go into the details because his father had some John Lang books at home, and that's what piqued his interest. And he found his grave and everything. And so Lang has basically been lost for a good 100 years. Uh, the last we know of him, some writer talking about him in 1903. And mind you, before that, he was very famous. During his
Mhm.
lifetime, practically all the English speaking world knew of him very well.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so he was lost. And why he was lost, we can come to that later in a in separate discussion. And so it was very fascinating because that's what one does serious and passionate research for, something that has not been done. And so I was very excited to find out stuff. It's like treasure hunt. So I started with Meerut, where his newspaper was published from, Agra, Masuri, where he lived during the summer, Calcutta, because Calcutta was the colonial capital. But unfortunately, we are great recyclers. So there are correspondences with Tilak Memorial Library in the 1960s when an Australian gentleman who wrote the first paper about John Lang, um, John Earnshaw, um, where the library had replied to him. But when I went to the library, they have nothing. They've recycled all of the stuff. And so I couldn't find much in India. And then I knew I'd have to go overseas. So I was looking at either India office in Britain or Australia, where he was born. And so it was a mix of everything. I'm a student of literature, but in Australia, on the Endeavour Fellowship and on the INLAX grant, I was with the history department. So it's a very curious sort of scholarship where you can see also in the book that the literary and the historical are combined. So I had to use the orthodox methods and the unorthodox methods. There's a gentleman called Victor Crittenden, who unfortunately passed away in 2013, a very good friend of mine. He was 86 then, back in 2010, when I was in Australia, who had collected a lot of John Lang's work, and he was working on it and had republished some of his novels and was hoping to republish all of his work. And so he was in that hunt, and he was very happy to work with me. And I was very excited to work with him. He'd come, in a proper suit every day to the library. So he had been a librarian, but was sort of an amateur scholar and a romantic about John Lang. So um, he had claimed, like, a lot of 19th century novels are pseudonymous. Lots of women were writing under male pseudonyms, or gentlemen did not write for profit. If you're zamindar, you cannot state that you're earning little pennies by writing an article in a newspaper or a journal. Right? And which is how Charles Dickens also became famous, because there are lots that is not by Charles Dickens which you think is Charles Dickens. And so Mr. Crittenden claimed a lot of anonymous, pseudonymous literature for John Lang, and I had to sift through a lot of it to verify his claims. And in the age of internet, you put one thing and it's copied in 10 other places immediately without
Right.
verifying sources. So it was really challenging. And I used to have these fights with him where, he'd be exasperated that he's helping me and I'm
Right.
reducing the number of works by John Lang. So it was, but still, he was very helpful, a father figure, and helped me a lot. So that was, I got a lot of material from him, but I had to do all kinds of things. Go to local historical societies where I found stuff. Go to synagogue. Go to community libraries. Meet descendants who did not have an idea of who John Lang was. Read a Burke's Peerage. All kinds of things where it got so unorthodox at certain point of time that one of the major chapters in the book, if you remember, is about Lala Jyoti Prasad, and he's the most fascinating character for me in John Lang's saga. So Prasad, that spelling is used only in the Caribbean now. In India, it was rectified to Prasad
Mhm.
after let's say the colonial powers left, but in the Caribbean it's still there. And so I contacted somebody called Moti Prasad,
Mhm.
thinking that he may be the great grandson of Jyoti Prasad or something. Now he was in the American academia, embroiled in some case, so he thought
Mm.
I'm
Right.
some sort of a spy. All kinds of things happened, and so
Right.
these things kept adding flavor. And I discovered this picture of um, Lala Jyoti Prasad passed off as Nana Sahib and contacted
Mhm.
the Illustrated London News, got that picture from their office, and all kinds of little tidbits. I was able to track down a descendant on the side of John Lang's daughter to the
Right.
present day, a lady called Monique Riccardi Cubitt, who's also mentioned in the book, and she freaked out. She also thought I was some kind of a spy. Later, I met her. She was very happy. So all these kind of things happened, and it was really a sort of a treasure hunt
Right.
to go about this. And I'm still at it, still trying to find stuff, original works of John Lang in his newspaper, etc.
Right.
The other part of the question
Mhm.
is about the objectivity of history and history writing itself. Now, there are several things about writing, about the process of writing. And as I've said in an earlier interview, me and my supervisor, we brainstormed over this material. There's a lot of material, whether to write it in a conventional form with literary theory or historical devices of historical criticism, write it in 5 chapters, or write it the way I eventually wrote. And my supervisor, Professor Shogito Bharuri, said that well, Pablo Picasso knew how to draw portraits very well, but he chose to do what he did because he had to, given his vision of art. And so you do what you have to. And so eventually I chose the narrative form because it is different narratives in which history is written.
Mm.
And so narrativization itself is a sort of theoretical idea, the way you tell a story, let's say, to simplify,
Right.
is how history is written. And so I have chosen to write it in a certain manner. Somebody else may choose to write it in a certain manner, show him more of a colonialist, whereas as I have shown him as an anti-colonialist, and that is my vision. That is how I
Hmm.
perceive him. And so that subjectivity to history will always be there. But the
Right.
thin line is the use of sources. As you can see in this 500-page book, 50 are notes, 50 are the sources. And so you have to um, refer to multiple sources. You have to like 20 footnotes to justify one thing. So I cannot say Violet is Lang's novel just because Mr. Crittenden has claimed it. There must have been claims and counterclaims,
Right.
and so it's very history writing is a. I mean, historical research is very tedious and also exciting. Um, but the writing, I have tried to free from the conventional jargon of history writing,
Right.
because eventually history is told as stories.
Right. It's quite curious when you mention it this way because um, so I am forgetting the name of the book, but recent work by Shrabni Basu was also very similar in its narrative form to what you were saying. And when such books come out, right, and when you read, and I'm very excited by this format because I think it represents history in a very unique way, makes it more presentable to audiences who might not find it appealing in the standard older format, right? But one has to ask, particularly when it comes to such subjective issues and such scarce topics, were there places where you probably took a narrative liberty, if I can frame it in that way, in to the extent that perhaps you envisaged a narration which may or may not have happened that way? It wasn't particularly disputable, but it kind of suited the narrative, so it went in. And if you did, like why did you do so? Like, what made you think that that would be the best way forward?
Well, like I said, you have to compare sources and sorry, and figure out um, what the best possible narrative and what is closest to fact. Of
Right.
course, you have to if you want to keep it interesting, you have to make it an interesting read, like you said. But at the same time, it has to be backed up with
Right.
certain ideas. So, for example, there's this episode of Lala Jyoti Prasad's picture being passed off as Nana Sahib's.
Hmm.
Now, the first time this story was told by William Forbes Mitchell, a soldier, much after John Lang had died, and that British newspapers were looking for Nana Sahib's picture, and they believed that since John Lang had met him, he would have a picture.
Right.
Now, John Lang, I wouldn't go into the very detailed story of it, but John Lang had won a case for Lala Jyoti Prasad and won a case of 30 lakhs for him, and as he got 3 lakhs, 10% of it. And Lala Jyoti Prasad had also given him his gold brocaded portrait, which Lang used to carry with him as his good luck charm everywhere. And so that was the portrait when he was in England in his house, and this journalist from Illustrated London News came and thought that this is Nana Sahib's picture, and Lang is alleged to have said, in the words of William Forbes Mitchell, that this guy resembles Nana Sahib only as much as you resemble the Queen. But the journalist still wanted something, like today's journalists want something, and went on to publish it. And then this mistake has been replicated
Wow.
across history. So this is a story which William Forbes Mitchell told, and uh, but I looked up this matter exhaustively if there was anything else on this matter. Otherwise, I would just have said that there's this soldier who told this story.
Hmm.
Um, and then to back this up, I had to look up the picture that appeared in the Illustrated London News, and it holds true that Nana Sahib is not looking like Nana Sahib. Exactly, he's this pot-bellied Lala. But at the same time, the confusion here is whether John Lang told the journalist that this was not Nana Sahib, or did John Lang deliberately plant
Right.
the picture as a prank, the character that he was?
Right.
And Henry George Keane, who's written his memoirs about India, mentions this incident where he says that this was a John Lang prank. So there are two takes by two different people after John Lang was dead.
Right.
And so, as a good storyteller and as a historian, I have to present both these pictures and leave it to the reader.
Right.
And both stories are equally plausible, and this is where uh, history gets tricky, and that is where you have to treat it as a narrative where there is this forking confusion um, of this sort. I'm willing to believe that it was a John Lang prank. At the same time, John Lang is witty enough to say that, oh, this guy resembles
Right.
Nana Sahib only as much as you resemble the Queen. That also sounds like John Lang. So I've written both things.
Fair enough. Fair enough. So, Dr. Ranjan, let me just jump on to some fun parts of this entire journey, because particularly because you mentioned how Mr. Ruskin Bond discovered the grave in Missouri, and that just, I think, strikes a nerve with like in a good way with all readers across India, because a lot of people have just grown up reading Ruskin Bond a lot. So, did you meet Mr. Bond for this? Did you? Is he also a
Oh, yes,
as much a John Lang enthusiast?
um, I mean, Mr. Bond has tons of stories to write, and especially children's stories and ghost stories. This was one of his ghost stories that he had written. And of course, this has been propelled by some Australian embassy's efforts in the decade of 2000, 2010, and then mostly my research pushing it, and eventually in this book form that's got this attention. So I did meet Mr. Bond a decade ago about
Hmm.
this, and he was very excited. And he told me whatever he could, and he also told me the directions to the grave.
Right.
And then I went with 8 friends, no less,
Yeah.
to look for John Lang's grave. And from Gun Hill, for those who Missouri, we climbed down to the Camel's Back Cemetery, like monkeys over rooftops and things like that, because the gates of the cemetery were closed. Um, and 8 of us hunted. It's a complicated cemetery, according to me, even though it's arranged by roughly decades and years. And a whole day of hunt and picnicking at the cemetery, we could not find the John Lang's grave. Apparently, it's very easy to find, and now that there's some kind of interest in Lang, there's also a plaque on the grave, and some people know about it, including Ganesh Saili, who's a Missouri writer. I have ventured 4 or 5 times to that cemetery. Um, and once I went with another friend of mine, Arup Chatterjee, who's also very interested in colonial stuff. But I've never been able to find the grave, and I don't hope grave that it remains an unfinished story.
Wow, wow! This is a fascinating tidbit that you weren't able to find it, because
I'm sure
it
if
just,
you go, you'll be able to find it.
I guess, like, from whatever I've read written by you about John Lang, I just think in all it's truly plausible that John Lang's ghost thinks it's really funny for you to not be able to find it, and make goes out of his way
I
to
guess
make
so.
sure that you can't find the grave. But
Yeah.
Dr. Ranjan, let me just take a step back and kind of ask you about your writing process. I mean, I know this is the work that you did as for your PhD, but as a writer, right? Because this is a very interesting space that you're working in. It's narrative nonfiction, so it kind of ties in, has certain links to fiction as well. Because
Mhm.
so
Yeah.
the question that I want to ask is about your writing style and process, because
Mhm.
what I've realized is that more often than not, I mean, there are when people are writing fiction, it's largely by a stroke of inspiration and thoughts flowing through them, which they need to pen down, and there's no organized structure to it, right? They just write and then structure comes later. While for academia, as it is for like any kind of college work, it's about structuring your time, like planning, researching, and structuring and writing it down. And then there's this
Mhm.
third kind of people who are kind of a mix of both, or just don't really have schedules. They write, they do things as they please. which bucket
Mhm.
do you fall into, right? And what's your, I don't know, is there a cliche writing cliche that you kind of follow, or is there a, I don't know,
Sure, sure.
how who are you as a
Uh,
writer?
sure. So I write in one go.
Okay.
It cannot be written like people would generally take their 5 years of PhD and write one chapter, go back to their supervisor, revise the chapter, and so on and so forth. As you can see, this is a sort of crazy form of writing that runs in small chapters, big chapters, sub chapters. It's the original is around 50 chapters.
Mhm.
Actually, it's 18, but subdivided, and so it's
Right.
more than 50. And and also, if you see, it does not follow a chronological scheme of Lang's life. It's written like a novel,
Mm-hmm.
um, almost in the genre of marvelous realism, or what is called magic realism in the English canon, where things jump back and forth in time. And that's the only trait of magic realism that I'm referring to. So I have gone as a novel does through association, starting with, let's say, Tom Taylor, because of Tom Taylor plagiarism, jumping to Abraham Lincoln, who died watching Tom Taylor's play, to jumping to Bernard Shaw, who also did not acknowledge his debt to John Lang, jumping to Kipling. And so it begins with literary allusions and literary debt that the world owes John Lang, rather than going to when he was born, what his life trajectory was, and all that. And I think the interesting way to tell stories is this associative way, the way we think as modernism believed, is that the later genres refined modernism in that it should also connect with the reader. And so my writing here, as you rightly said, is not exactly in the realm of history writing. But there is something called fictocriticism these days, where fiction is written along with its criticism, meta criticism within. And
Right.
so, on the other hand, there is creative nonfiction. So this is nonfiction, but this is history. This is serious history. There's nothing that is not. I have not taken any liberties in terms
Right.
of introducing a character or introducing a love affair between the Rani of Jhansi and John Lang, as the television serial on ZTV did.
Right.
There are no liberties taken with history at all, but at the same time, um, I try to make it funky and groovy, like John Lang's character. And I think it's possible without taking liberties of fiction, uh, to take it in a poetic manner. Uh, Many critics of poetry and poets themselves have argued that poetry is close to truth. And so, if you take a little bit of poetic license without compromising on the fact or sources, you can achieve a style of writing in creative fiction which is very close to novel writing. And as for schedules, I'm very bad with it, as I was hunting this and that. So today
Right.
I'd be meeting John Lang's descendants. Tomorrow I'd be emailing Ruti Prasad. The third day I'd be wandering around a graveyard, and things like that. And the book was actually written in one go, in 4 months. So it
Okay.
was
Oh.
on the edge. It was on the edge 4 months before the submission. So 170,000 words in 4 months, which was a lot of work, an
Yeah.
average of 12 hours plus work, all those 4 months. Like I said, I cannot write in parts that the flavor
Right.
would go. So it
Right.
was tedious editing it when the publishers wanted it to cut down from 170,000 to 100,000, because writing can happen because you're high on writing and on the passion of the matter, but editing is a boring job. You have to be and also when you have to cut down almost 60% of it, then you also have to retain the flavor, that language,
Right.
That's very challenging. So actually, editing took 1 year, writing took 4 months.
That's I think for all budding writers who are listening to the podcast, which are a few, I think that's one of the biggest lessons that often comes away, that editing is the task when it comes to it, and clearly you've demonstrated. I think there's a Hemingway
Though I
quote
wish
which.
that this had not been edited, and I
Mhm,
hope, I
mhm,
mean, apart from the basic editing, this has
right.
been reduced to half its size. And I hope that in future I'll be able to publish the entire thing and make the readers suffer double this length, meaning
I,
an 800
I
page book.
I don't think readers would be suffering, because I think people who will buy that book will be people who will be super interested after reading this, I guess.
Right.
But
Sure. I hope so too.
but yeah, I think, I mean, it just reminds me, as I was saying, of a Hemingway quote. I'm not too sure till date if it's actually something Hemingway said, but I
Hmm.
just, it kind of goes with what Hemingway behaved at. It's like,
Hmm.
write drunk, edit sober, which was just meant to reflect the entire process, as you were talking about. When you're writing, you're
Sure.
just high on it and you just let it flow, but you have to edit
Right.
your work out into a very somber manner. Uh,
Yeah.
but so
Talking of Hemingway, if you
yes.
don't mind, I just came back from Miami, and Key West is on the outskirts of Miami, and
Mhm,
250 kilometers roughly. And I've lived in Miami thrice and been to Key West 6 or 7 times. That's
mhm,
where Hemingway's house is, which is why I'm
right,
mentioning
yes,
him. And anybody who goes to Key West goes to Hemingway's house.
right.
And much like John Lang's grave, I have reached Hemingway's house but never gone inside it, because by the time I reach it, it's always shut.
Sure. Oh.
And so, what is generally a 4 hour journey somehow gets completed in 8 or 9 hours. And by the time it's sunrise. So, like John Lang's grave, Hemingway also eludes me.
I just think, I think this is absolute just John Lang deciding that, okay, this is one more person I need to prank in life, and he's trying to
Yeah,
do this with you. But Dr. Ranjan, that's actually very interesting. The kind of life you have lived, the kind of stories you've seen, and the people you've met. It's supremely fascinating. But it kind of
right.
makes me think again, because as you can see, I read a lot. Like, I absolutely love reading, and I just like to believe that writers need to be good readers to kind of to be able to write stuff. So,
Right.
are you a bibliophile too, or is it just like academic books that you read? Or, and if you do like to read, what kind of books do you read? How did you start reading as a child? If you could just give us an insight into that.
Sure. Yeah, I do read a lot, and different kinds of stuff, um, fiction, non-fiction, poetry, and other stuff as well, curious stuff as well.
The poetry bit was
Um,
quite obvious when you mentioned that you were reading that encyclopedia of Australian poets from
yeah,
a particular set of 10, 20
yeah,
years, 200 years ago. Yeah,
yeah. Um, and also movies, I think, contribute
right,
a lot to
right,
writers' ideas. Um, it depends. It's off and on what I'm interested in. Uh, Sometimes one is interested in Latin American fiction because it's so remarkable. Sometimes Victorian novels. John Lang got me into Victorian novels, and a different kind of Victorian
right,
novels of the Lang kind,
right.
which are very different for the sheer um, ornamentation, and the use of language was so different in the 19th century. Um, and I like reading random stuff the most. Apart from, of course, being an English professor, one has had to, and as a student of literature from bachelor's to PhD, one has
Right,
had to go through all kinds of literary canons, the old
right,
British or or the new writing from across the world, from Africa, from very interesting parts of the world.
right.
But I really like reading random stuff. So, for example, in John Lang, there's this character called Andrew Thomas Turton Peterson, ATTP,
Mm-hmm.
who was very interested in spiritualism. Spiritualism is basically planchette seance, where you call a spirit and
Right,
ask them questions. And so he caught a guy off the street called William Lawrence, WL. And the medium is called sensitive in that canon of spiritualism. And so he invokes people from Aristotle to his own time, to Lord Clive, to John Lang, to Lala Jyoti Prasad, all those people who are dead, and ask them questions. So it's world history according to ATTP, heard through spirits, communicated by WL.
Right.
And or I'll give you another example of born again Dr. Walter Simcoe, MD,
Mhm.
whose prefix is doctor and suffix is MD. He's doctor on both sides. And he is a reincarnationologist, and his book was born again as well. I went to two of his book launches of the same book. The same book was launched twice at the same venue in Delhi. Now, my poetry book is being launched twice because it was launched in America in March and it will be
Right.
launched in India in April. But his book was launched at the same venue twice in subsequent years. And basically, the idea is that people retain their facial features and their inherent personalities. The gender may change, not normally, and the soul may have migrated before one person died. So I'm bringing this up because he claims that he's very interested in Bollywood. He claims that Shah Rukh Khan was Sadhana Bose, who was a 1940s actress, a very interesting character from a very remarkable Bengali family connected to Subhash Chandra Bose, etc.
Right.
Now, of course, anybody would sort of junk this book, but for me, it was an entry into Sadhana Bose's life and playing around with this idea of Shah Rukh Khan being Sadhana Bose, and he was actually asked this question
Right.
that Walter Simcoe MD claims that you are Sadhana Bose. He said, no. And he actually replied to it.
Mhm.
Shah Rukh Khan said, "Oh, but how can I be Sadhana Bose? She died 8 years after um, um, I was born."
Uh,
Walter Simcoe MD answers that question.
oh,
He
oh, oh,
doesn't answer it about this character, but about other characters. And in an unpublished paper, which I hope to publish somewhere, I have argued that, well, her soul had already migrated to Shah Rukh Khan, and which is why she died wretched and poor on the streets of Calcutta in 1973, 8 years after his birth. So I'm just making a light of it.
right.
I do read a lot of serious stuff, but it's fun to read these alternative kinds of things which
Right.
give you a special peek into things.
Absolutely. Well, Dr. Ranjan, we've unfortunately come to the end of the podcast. It was absolutely lovely talking to you. I just have one question before we leave. You mentioned you have a book launch, your poetry collection launching in April. If you could just tell us a
Sure.
bit about that, and if we can look forward to some of your other work, and if you could tell us something about that.
Sure. Unfortunately, I did not keep them in handy right now, but maybe you can add pictures to them.
Sure.
The first poetry collection called Find Me, Let It Go In, I'm almost 30, came out in 2018, which, as you can guess, is a sort of a tribute to Leonard Cohen. But that was the first poetry collection. And the second poetry collection is between, let's say, the Bay of Bengal and the Bay of Biscayne, between Bhubaneswar, where I spent a lot of time, and Miami, where I spent a lot of time. So basically, it's an ocean themed poetry
Mhm.
collection that came out last month when I was still in US, and I hope it comes out in April. I mean, it's done. It just depends on the publisher when he's able to bring it out, either April end or May. It's called The Knot of Juggernaut, or The Mystery of Miami Mambo Sexuality. If you want me to explain the intriguing title, um, Juggernaut is the misspelling of Jagannath by the British, and then it acquired a meaning of its own.
One.
Juggernaut is anything that is heavy and difficult to move, much like
Right.
Jagannath Yatra.
Right.
And so, how we are knotted by Juggernaut, and also because Juggernaut doesn't have hands, Jagannath doesn't have hands, right? But
Right.
still, it seems, and so it's easy for the divine to wash off their responsibility in acts of human beings by claiming they don't have hands. And the mystery of Miami Mambo Sexuality is a play on Michel Foucault's history of sexuality, is the mystery of sexuality. Miami Mambo, because I did meet a lot of Mambos in Miami. Miami is, uh, people think of it as merely a party city, but there's very deep esoteric spiritual traditions that hide under the cover of that South Miami beach. So that was just an explanation of this title. So it's called The Knot of Juggernaut, and it'll be available end of this month. Okay.
Okay, I mean, those sound absolutely fascinating, just like John Lang. I actually can't wait to read both of them, and I will be checking them out. But for today, thank you for joining us, Dr. Ranjan. This was absolutely wonderful. We loved having you on our podcast, and the links to the book are available in the comment section and in the about section for this podcast and on YouTube. Please check it out. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Siddharth. It was a pleasure and it's wonderful having this conversation. Look forward to many more such conversations. Thank you so much.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please check us out on all our social media platforms. We are available across all podcasting platforms on YouTube, on Instagram. You can find us at the rate Kitabi Karwan on Instagram, or just search Kitabi Karwan on Google or a platform of your choice and you'll find us. We carry out Instagram lives, giveaways, we talk about books, we talk to bibliophiles, talk to authors, and basically try and create a reader's world through all of our platforms. Do check us out and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you.